Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 21st of February and we have a lot to cover today. We're going to start off by looking at the Russian advances to the west of Avdiivka. We're going to focus most of the video on southern Donetsk because there are several key points along that line of contact that need to be discussed, and I do believe that this will be one of the most active parts of the front line in the coming weeks. Then we'll look at the Orikhiv sector and we'll end off by looking at Krynky. So let's begin by quickly focusing on Avdiivka. So as we all know, the Russian forces took full control over the city on the 17th of February. So for several days, you had the Russians conducting combing operations in the city itself, but really they didn't let the Ukrainians that withdrew further westwards much of any time to rest. And so the Russian forces, starting on the night of the February 19th, they began launching attacks from their positions that had just been taken over in Avdiivka, further westwards along a dirt road towards Lastochkyne. And this was likely done in order to, first of all, create a buffer zone for Avdiivka, and that's a part of Russia's wider plan for this sector. But it's also in order to keep the Ukrainians on their feet so they wouldn't have enough time to dig in and to turn Lastochkyne into a fortress that would have to be fought over and retreated over later on. And so the Russian forces did launch this initial assault. Perhaps it would be in order to gauge the extent of the Ukrainian defenses and how capable they really are of holding on to a frontline position when being put under significant pressure. And so on the 19th, you had these Russian sorties, very small numbers, squad-sized forces that were reported by the Ukrainians that made their way along this particular dirt road that I'm going to mark with this arrow, and they reached the eastern outskirts of the village. And from there, they were repelled by the Ukrainians. And then by the morning of the 20th, you did have a larger Russian assault, which was recorded by the Ukrainian drones, and video of that assault was released by the Ukrainian unit, the 225th Battalion of the 127th Territorial Defense Brigade. So that is a unit that's holding on to Lastochkyne at the moment. This is one of the units that was fighting, I believe, in southern Avdiivka or in the city in general, and they were one of the units that was forced to withdraw in the final days of the retreat, but nonetheless, they are still holding on to the front line in the video. And what they claim is that they faced an assault from one tank and 6 BMPs, and that they were able to damage or cause the Russians to abandon all 6 BMPs, but that the tank was able to escape. And so I have footage of one of those BMPs getting destroyed at this entrance to Lastochkyne. I don't know about the other ones. Something important to note when looking at some of the drone imagery that's going to come out from this region is that the Ukrainians may have abandoned BMPs on their way out of Avdiivka, and that might look like it's actually Russian vehicles that are abandoned. And so it's hard to tell in some instances, like in the instance of this image here, whether the BMP is actually Russian or Ukrainian. But in any case, this is actually a video from the Shadow Drone Unit, a Ukrainian unit that's operating across much of the Donetsk front to provide drone support where there are artillery shortages, and it destroys a BMP. We don't know if it's a Ukrainian BMP because, of course, the Ukrainians don't want the Russians retrieving it and using it for their own purposes. But either way, the Ukrainians were able to survive the first attack by the Russian forces on this line, and perhaps the fact that they're holding on indicates that they want to buy time as they build up further defenses in villages like Orikhiv that are important to Ukraine's next line of defense they're trying to set up in these villages to the west of Avdiivka. Now let's look at the situation around Pobjeda, which is a very small village, but it does have a significant importance for the entire battlefield in this region going back years. And so even at the beginning of the war, this node of defense for the Ukrainians, it gave them access to a highway leading into Marinka. It gave them a firing position and a viewing position of the entire landscape through which the Russians were advancing to the east and to the south. And so it is a great position to organize your forward elements in order to get a good view of the enemy and to fire upon them and seek cover. And so that's what the Ukrainians have been doing for a very long time, using these positions. It's also located on a local height that overlooks the positions to the south along this valley that runs from Novomikhailivka to Kostantinivka on this green line over here, and also some of the valleys that are located in fields to the east. So certainly for the Russians in the DPR, it has been a key goal since the beginning of the war, but their efforts at taking it over became more realistic in December of last year when the Russian forces made key gains in Marinka, and in particular in the southern part of the town, they were able to get full control. And using this axis that was now under their control, they were able to advance along this highway, which connects from Druzhby Avenue, so the 053 highway. And this axis allowed them to move armored vehicles and tanks towards the northeastern outskirts of Pobjeda, so that was very important. And then also in January, the Russian forces took over the Zverinets fortification system, which is located over here. This is another one of these defense nodes near the line of contact that the Ukrainians have been relying on for a long time. And so now with the Russians having control over it, they have a forward operating node to the northeast of Novomykhailivka, but also to the southeast of Pobjeda, which allowed them to organize their forces closer to the front line and conduct attacks towards the fields that are on the outskirts of Pobjeda. So what you saw throughout late January and the first weeks of February is the Russian forces using their positions over here to gradually advance using support from tanks. So the tanks would come in like one or two at a time, fire towards the Ukrainian fortified positions and tree lines. They mainly had dugouts, not trenches, because the area is pretty small, but this was still important as the Russians had support from the tank fire and also artillery support from the Donetsk grouping. And so one by one, the Russians took over all of these different strongholds along the highway before they made it about 1 kilometer to the northeast of Pobjeda. So let's measure that out actually. So they were able to reach generally this point over here where I have the cursor marked. And this gave them a clear field of vision into Pobjeda. It allowed them to direct fire towards the village itself. And so there was very significant shelling of the village. And this is a village, again, that's extremely small. Any sort of platoon that's going to be located over here is concentrated. And there's only so many places where you could see cover after it gets shelled so many times. And so eventually by around, you could say, the 20th, you had very heavy Russian shelling in this direction, including with FPV drones that struck Ukrainian positions. And you added TOS-1A artillery fire onto the Ukrainians over here. And that is what prompted the Russians to launch their attack and actually correct the record, not on February 20th, around February 18th. And so the Russian assault over here was likely directed by the 255th Motor Rifle Regiment. And there was also some support from more generally elements of the 20th Motor Rifle Division. And so at first, the Russian forces were able to gain control over this easternmost section of the village, including the agricultural facilities. And there are some trenches built up by the Ukrainians over there. The Ukrainians did not give up on the village without a fight. They did conduct localized counterattacks, as was reported by Russian sources, but those were eventually repelled by the Russians due to the just insane amounts of artillery fire that was output on the village. And there's some geolocated markers of this entire affair. So here you could have the Ukrainians withdrawing following the Russian attack on a tree line to the east of Pobjeda. Then here there's FPV strikes by the Russians on the Ukrainian positions. And then this footage shows the Russian forces actually entering the residential section of the town and raising the flag, which indicates control. For a long time, the Ukrainian defense over here was led by the 2nd Battalion of the 95th Air Assault Brigade, which is a unit that was recently moved into the southern Donetsk front to give additional support to the 79th Air Assault Brigade. So they have their elements split up between like Orikhiv and Novomykhailivka. So they were defending in that region, but that was definitely not enough to hold back the Russian attacks around Pobjeda. And so in recent weeks, the Ukrainians have moved in reinforcements to the southern Donetsk front due to their understanding that the Russians were ramping up pressure. So for instance, you have the 31st Mechanized Brigade, was fought in the southern counteroffensive for a couple of months. It was operating on the northern flank of Avdiivka, and now they have a noted presence around the Pobjeda area. And you also have the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. This is a unit that fought very heavily in the southern counteroffensive, especially in the areas around Robotyne and directly to the east of it, which we'll talk about later in the video. And they were moved also into this area. They also moved in their Leopards. So for instance, they sent some Leopard 2A4s directly to the front lines and engage with the Russian armor to try to hold it back for as long as possible. In one such encounter on February 16th, the Leopard actually fell into a Fab 500 crater and was forced to be abandoned. And in another video that was released by the Russians, I believe yesterday, there was another Leopard 2A4 that the Ukrainians were forced to abandon. And so they abandoned 2 of their tanks, and the Russian sources claimed that there were 3 Leopards lost in total. And so the 33rd Brigade and the 95th Brigade, their positions, they were forced to evacuate further westwards towards these fields over here, there is a small operating node where there are probably Ukrainian forces, but generally this area to the west is just filled with open. So in this red box, I'll mark Pobjeda, and this should give you an idea of why the Russian forces fought over it so hardly and why the Ukrainians really tenaciously held on to their positions. The reason is because Pobjeda, it gives the Russian forces access to this highway, which is marked in yellow, which leads directly into the village of Kostantinivka. I'll mark that in orange. Kostantinivka is located on a valley, first of all. So again, as you approach it along the valley, you have options to fire upon it directly, and you get very good field of vision of the Ukrainian positions in the region. But either way, Kostantinivka is a key node for the Ukrainian defense. It sort of connects the Ukrainian rear to the Ukrainian forward positions. So the Ukrainian rear would be further westwards in this area over here, and the Ukrainian defense would be in a place like Novomykhailivka. And so that's the bridge between them, both in terms of supplies, because there's a road that's moving in through this area, and through communication and command posts. And so the Russian logic would be to advance along a predetermined path along a highway and also through some of these fields directly to the south to put pressure both physically but also through firepower onto the Ukrainian bridge that's connecting the Ukrainian forward elements to the rear. And the Ukrainian forward elements are in very fierce battles right now, so they need all the help they can get from the outside, whether it be from shells, whether it be from additional manpower coming in to hold the line. And so it's critical that Kostantinivka remain intact in order for the Ukrainians to continue their defense of Novomykhailivka. And so with the Russians trying to flank the position, it does put the Ukrainians in Novomykhailivka in extreme danger. The Ukrainians in Novomykhailivka are also in danger because of the capture of this Varenets fortification system, as I talked about before, because that's located on a height, and so is the area south of Pobjeda, which the Russians are now capturing. And so you have all these heights that I marked in these red dotted lines, perimeter, which overlook the valley on which Novomykhailivka is located. But more generally, if we go back to the regular, you can see that Kostantinivka and all the towns that are connected to it along the same road are very important for the defense of Vuhledar, as this entire town cluster is what's preventing the Russians from advancing along the highway from the north to the south to try to flank the Ukrainian positions that are first in Vodyane and then from there in Vuhledar. And so the fall of Kostantinivka would give the Russians that opportunity to, instead of attack directly forward into the Ukrainian fortified positions in Vuhledar, it would give them a new option to flank it from the northeast. And so that's some of the broader Russian plans that could be carried out in a very long time frame depending on the Ukrainian resistance. But that's just a general blueprint and why the Ukrainians are fighting for it so difficultly. And while we're on the conversation of the southern Donetsk front, it was reported yesterday that there was a Ukrainian HIMARS strike on a Russian training camp in Trudivske, which is a village that's about 27 kilometers away from the front line. Here you can see the training facility, and you could see that it is pretty close to the city of Volnovakha, which is a very important Russian rail hub that's connecting a lot of their supply lines leading to the front. And then I'll show the measuring stick for you guys to get an idea of how close it is to, for instance, the Ukrainian groupings around Vuhledar. And so the Ukrainians, they hit the training facility. According to some Russian Telegram channels, there were about 65 killed in the strike, but based on the footage that I have marked over here and some of the other footage that was released, you could count around 30 dead just in those alone. So again, this gives you an idea of how there was just a massive grouping of Russian soldiers in this one particular area. It seems like they were all lining up in one of these fields as a part of their general regiment. And at that point, the Ukrainians struck, knowing that they were all grouped together, and inflicted a high amount of killed, and we don't even know about the wounded. And so, again, this is a pretty foolish decision to put such a large amount of forces near the front line. You know, we don't even know the size yet, but it could be over 100 troops that were stationed together in the same barracks. So again, that would be going into several platoons, going into company size in the same area. That is just something that is foolish given the Ukrainian HIMARS capabilities and given the fact that they are receiving a lot of intelligence from the NATO countries, which allows them to conduct these pinpoint strikes towards areas that are relatively close to the front line, like this village. This isn't that deep. Volnovakha, again, if you look at it from measuring, it's only about 20 kilometers away, so it is definitely within the range of Ukraine's longer range artillery. And so definitely The local Russian command is going to have to think of ways to organize their forces and transport them towards the front line in a way that isn't putting them at risk. And likely, given their positioning and the fact that they were members of the 39th Motor Rifle Brigade, they were probably going to be sent to the area around Novomykhailivka. On the Orikhiv sector, I'm planning to do a more in-depth video in the future about the particulars of the topography and the troop composition and the advances. But for now, as a general overview, it was reported yesterday, February 20th, by Deep State that the Russian forces were able to gain control of further fields to the northeast of Novoprokopivka in an area that was previously imagined to be a gray zone. So generally, in these regions over here, the Russians secured additional territory, and the Ukrainians withdrew further north towards their positions within Robotyne. They do still have some positions in this forested area over here and some of these other tree lines. And the defenses they're using are either dugouts or trenches that were actually built by the Russians in the spring of last year in preparation for the summer counteroffensive. And so now, if we look a bit to the west, one such trench that is really being fought over heavily is this trench system to the south of Robotyne. This is a system that is well connected. It's several trenches that have intricate, it has an intricate labyrinth of trenches that are spreading out throughout an area that, if we measure it, is about 1.7 kilometers in width. And some of the areas are covered up. They're not exactly tunnels, but you can see them from above because there's some camouflage covering the openings to the trenches. And so this is an area that's really good as a defensive node. It's actually located on a height that's overlooking both the Robotyne and, to a lesser extent, Novoprokopivka. And that's why the Ukrainians were really trying to hold on to it for as long as possible. But nevertheless, when the Russians uptaked their assaults in this region, starting around the 17th of February, they sent in armored assets to attack along this highway and along several other tree lines, and their infantry dismounted, and they were able to clear out the westernmost sections and the central sections of this trench system. The Ukrainians are still present in the eastern section of the trench, and the Russian presence was confirmed by videos from the Ukrainian side, which shows their drones dropping grenades on the Russian side as they were storming the fortification system. And in preparation for the storming, the Russian forces themselves, using the Beaver drone units, they conducted FPV drone strikes on the Ukrainians in their dugouts, and the 1,152nd Territorial Motor Rifle Regiment conducted their own artillery and FPV preparation on the Ukrainians in the same fortifications. And at the moment, the Ukrainian units that are defending generally in the Orikhiv sector include the 65th Mechanized Brigade defending in the west and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade defending in the east, with some support from National Guard units and some independent drone groups. And then if you look further westwards, the Russian forces are also taking advantage of their favorable positions located to the east of the village of Kopani. This area that I'm marking in red is very important to the Russians because it's located on a height that's overlooking Robotyne and supply lines leading into it. And it's also located just so close to the village, and with the Russian firepower superiority, it gives them a perfect opportunity to fire onto incoming Ukrainian targets in the village and outside of it. In this area, the Russians also have a lot of trenches that are marked in light green that are utilized as operating points. And so, really, since the 17th of February, the Russian forces have been uptaking pressure with armored assets, trying to break past the current lines and putting a lot of pressure on Robotyne's westernmost flank. So, I guess if you were to measure the vectors of attack, there was one generally in this direction. There was one along this trench network over here and along that particular tree line. And there was one further north in an area that is directly to the southwest of the city of Orikhiv. So that would be around here if you marked it with the geolocation. But as of now, none of those armored assaults have succeeded in penetrating the Ukrainian line. So far, the Ukrainian 65th Mechanized Brigade has been able to hold back most of the Russian attacks, but in some cases they have been successful in pushing the front line several hundred meters eastwards. And so in this case, you could see the Russian forces were able to advance about 1.5 kilometers and nearly reach the entrance to the village of Robotyne. But for now, the Ukrainian defense over here does hold. But an area where it failed to hold is further eastwards in the fields that are directly to the north of the Surovikin line. The Surovikin line is over here. the Ukrainians have been forced to largely abandon any positions that had passed the Surovikin line. The last remnant is this area over here that I'll mark in blue, which is an area past the anti-tank ditch in the Dragon's Teeth. But for the most part, the Russian forces, really starting in about December or January, the VDV elements started to take back Ukrainian positions that they'd taken over in the summer and the fall. And some of this was due to the Russian pressure itself, but some of it was also due to the Ukrainians being really forced to withdraw of their own accord, just because their grouping in the Orikhiv sector was diminishing as reinforcements were sent elsewhere, and so they couldn't hold the front line, and they were running out of artillery, and they were located in positions that were simply too far away from the main garrison in the Orikhiv sector, and so that's abandoned some of their forwardmost positions that are very close to the Surovikin line in favor of more tenable positions in some of the trenches the Russians build directly to the east of the village of Robotine. And as you can see marked in this red perimeter, the Russian forces, of course, took advantage of that and took over some of those dugouts in some of those open. And lastly, looking at Krynky, the Ukrainians did make their presence known in the village last week, around the 13th of February, where they released several videos of the Ukrainian flag being raised in various water tanks around the village and in houses in the central part of the village. And again, this was meant as a symbol to show the world that they're still located in the village. But in the weeks since then, we've heard less from the Ukrainians. They have released some videos targeting Russian BTRs and troops located in eastern Krynky. But as the days went on, starting around the 20th of February, actually, there were reports from the Russian side that they were able to fully capture the village. And then this was claimed by Shoigu during a speech where he said that Krynky had been taken and that the Ukrainians had suffered in total 1,820 casualties during the course of the battle. Now, when you look at the amount of Ukrainian troops that at most in a given moment were within the Krynky bridgehead, not just in Krynky, but also in the islands around it, it was probably several hundred, nearing 300, 400. So it is unlikely that, 4 or 5 times over that amount were taken as casualties in Krynky itself, but likely there were several hundred casualties in this bridgehead over the course of 4 months, because remember, the Ukrainians have had a permanent presence past the Konka River for 4 months, and during that time period, you had 4 Marine brigades involved in the operations, rotating forces. And again, they're located in an area that is very it's not suitable for their operations. That's how I'd put it, because it's past 2 rivers, one of them being an extremely wide river, Dnieper River. They don't have sufficient firepower. They're located on a valley that's being attacked by the Russian side. And again, there are issues with logistics. And so in terms of casualties, those weren't looking good. But despite that fact, the Marine brigades were not rotated out. They continued fighting for 4 months. And it was also claimed by the 810th Brigade that they were able to get full control over the village, and that there was no more Ukrainian attempts at attacking them. And so we don't have verification of that yet, because the videos that have come out, and there are 3, are mainly from the eastern sections of Krynky, and there's still ambiguity about the central section where there are houses where feasibly there could be Ukrainians in basements that are resisting. But let's look at the videos that were released. So there's one video of FPVs hitting Russian soldiers in Krynky, confirms their presence. In this video released by Deep State, there are 2 Russian soldiers that raise the flag in Krynky in the ruins and then withdraw towards the forest located further south. Then in this video over here, I'll mark it over here actually, there was a video of the Russian forces where, again, they raised a flag in central Krynky, and another flag that was raised was of the 384th Marine Special Purpose Battalion, which is a DPR unit, but for whatever reason it's operating in the Kherson front. And so this was the furthest extent of the Russian advances. And there was one more video of the Russian forces being filmed in some of the ruins of Krynky, which I have not seen a geolocation of yet, but still no geolocation from the central section. And it is important to know just in terms of the particulars, because there still is a protracted Ukrainian resistance, not just in Krynky, but also across this entire bridgehead to the south of the Dnieper River, in a lot of these islands and a lot of this marshland. Even the Russian sources that claim the capture of Krynky do acknowledge that the Ukrainians do still hold positions over here and are conducting rotations at night or during foggy periods to continue trying to harass the Russian forces. As I've said before, the Ukrainian brigades here have been fighting for 4 months, and so we need further proof of this, but I would not be surprised if at least some of those elements have to be rotated out due to just a complete exhaustion, and also because of more pressing parts of the front line, not in Kherson, but also in Donetsk, and generally also in the Orikhiv sector, which may need the attention of these Ukrainian Marine brigades, because these are 4 units that have a lot of experience. And for this past period in time, which has been a period in time where the Russians have had the initiative, they have not been involved in Ukraine's key defenses in areas like Avdiivka or now Novomykhailivka because they have been stuck in the fighting around Krynky. And so it'll be interesting to see if we get further confirmation of the movement of these units either to the rear or directly towards another part of the front line to try to hold the line over there. And if that were to be the case, then it would show that the Ukrainians really are desperate for reinforcements in those directions, because these former brigades have not really been given any sort of time to rest. They have been involved in some very heavy fighting. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.